Here's what got that selling going. First, it went after the Bush administration over wiretapping. Now, setting its sights on the Obama administration over snooping. Don't look now, but this is now bad because the ACLU is now suing. Wow. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto. And the American Civil Liberties Union just filing a lawsuit against the Obama administration over the government's massive phone records grab, challenging a program that it states, and I quote here, vacuums up information about every phone call placed within, from, or to the United States, going on to say that it violates the First Amendment rights of free speech and the right of privacy protected by the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution itself. To the ACLU's Alexander Abdo with this just breaking news. Why did you do this?
Neil, thanks for having me. The government should be able to surveil people when it has reason to do so, but it shouldn't be indiscriminately sweeping up the communications of millions of innocent Americans. We learned last week of a sweeping program of surveillance. The ACLU is a customer of Verizon business and has been targeted under this law, and it's simply unconstitutional and un-American.
All right, when the ACLU went after President Bush for wiretapping, and by extension, the same argument holds on this administration for snooping, that argument being what?
Well, the government's argument for snooping has always been that it sometimes has a reason to suspect people of wrongdoing. The problem is when the government goes beyond that reason, when it tries to amass as much information as possible. We've now grown the biggest haystack in the history of the intelligence community's work, but there's no proof that we're any closer to finding the needle.
Do you get a sense, though, that this argument, and you're right, through Republican and Democratic administrations, it is a familiar one, maybe for all I know a justifiable one, that we have your interest at heart when we start rifling through records, that this is for your good and keeping you alive. The ACLU then appears to be saying, here's where we draw the line when it gets so big and indiscriminate?
That's exactly right. The Constitution imposes real limits on the government. The Constitution allows the government to pursue terrorists, to pursue those who break the law, but it doesn't allow the government to sweep up everyone's communications in the way it has been doing. And for 200 years, our government has been able to keep us safe, staying true to those values. There's no reason we need to sacrifice those values now.
You know, Alexander, what makes this kind of unique in terms of your group now is that, by and large, it was largely in agreement with then Senator Barack Obama's stance against potential abuses of the Patriot Act, and that it could lead to abuses of freedom and personal liberties. And for whatever promised good, it would do a lot of bad. I'm very much trivializing it, and I apologize for that. But what do you think of just the odd flip of events now that has you targeting now President Obama and the practices his administration has taken?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and a hard question. And I think the explanation is that power can be seductive, and especially in the era of big data, where it's increasingly easy for the government to aggregate all sorts of information about Americans. It's seductive for the intelligence communities to do precisely what the NSA is doing, which is to gather as much as possible, to collect it all now and ask questions later. And so it's understandable that the government is trying to do this, but it's simply not constitutional.
So, Alexander, let me ask you one final question. Apparently the germ for this sweeping NSA action, collecting over 115 million Verizon phone records, was post the Boston terror incident, I believe middle of April, and that they then got a court order, were told a court order, to have Verizon hand over those records just to make sure, as they tried to cross-reference databases and names, that this was not part of a larger plot, or to find indications of a potential larger plot, so that they argue the greater good was involved here. You say that it got too sweeping, too large, and no good came of that, hence this suit.
Well, the best reports now are that the order that we saw last week has absolutely nothing to do with the Boston bombing. The government has apparently been getting these orders for the last 7 years.
Yeah, but I believe it got so big post-Boston. But you're quite right. This was a common request, but that it got very big, using that as the motive. You don't buy that? Your group doesn't buy that?
Well, I think the broader point, whether or not that's true, is that the government has plenty of tools at its disposal if it wants to target a particular number. If, for example, they had the numbers of the two brothers who were accused of the Boston bombing, they can pretty easily search their records for those numbers. They can search the records of telephone companies to see whether they're connected with other potential terrorist plots. But what they don't need to accomplish that end is access, for example, to the ACLU's records, to the records of Fox News, to the records of the countless viewers at home who are innocent of any wrongdoing. Their records just aren't relevant to terrorist investigations.
Alexander, thank you very, very much. We appreciate your coming here. Just to update you that if you just tuned in, that the ACLU is the first major organization to sue the United States government, more to the point, the White House, over what it says is a freedom infringement like no other, invading people's personal privacies, their phone records and the like, and a reach on the part of the NSA that goes beyond the pale. Now, when it comes to the NSA and why it did what it did, we're about 50 minutes or so from a briefing that House members, each and every one of them, are going to get on why the NSA did what it did and to whom it did. One guy is already threatening a brief on all of this and a lot more, Republican Congressman Justin Amash in Michigan. Congressman, what do you make of what the ACLU has just done? Because this is the same ACLU that aggressively went after President Bush for what it deemed at the time individual liberty infringements and more. And now it is doing the same with this president.
Thanks, Neil, for having me on. And I applaud what the ACLU is doing. They were right to go after President Bush when he violated our civil liberties, and they're right to go after President Obama when he does the same. And a number of members of Congress are prepared to file amicus briefs in support of their efforts.
All right, now you're going to be going into this briefing. I suppose this is going to be top secret type of a briefing. I don't know how you guys do this sort of thing, but what do you want to hear out of NSA officials or who's ever ultimately going to be conducting this?
Well, I want to hear how large the scope is of the surveillance. I want to hear what the reasons they're going to use to justify this type of surveillance. And I want to hear about what we as a Congress can do about it to make sure that American civil liberties are protected.
Now, it's very hard for 435 of you guys then to be quiet as church mice after that, right? Are you sworn to secrecy in this meeting?
Well, it's a classified briefing. We're not going to be allowed to speak publicly about the details of the briefing. But I hope more and more of my colleagues are waking up to the fact that a lot of what the government is doing is unconstitutional. I voted against the Patriot Act. I voted against the FISA Amendments Act. We had a number of briefings to different degrees over the past couple years. Not every member necessarily attended a briefing, but right. I certainly knew enough to know that I should vote no on these bills and that they were a threat to the liberties of Americans.
Then, Congressman, what do you think of those who did vote for the Patriot Act and did vote for follow-up pieces of legislation that clamped down on this sort of thing in the effort of getting and keeping us safe, presumably? This shock and surprise that they didn't know that was the case. The administration said that those who approved this sort of thing did, in fact, know it was the case.
Well, I think there are several members who knew the details and understood what they were voting on and actually support the efforts of the administration. And there are many other members, probably a larger number of members, who, even though they knew the details, maybe didn't understand the scope of what was going on and feel a bit betrayed right now. I'm hopeful that they can realize the extent to which the government is violating the rights of Americans and change their minds about these votes in the future.
Now, is part
and,
of your...
and look back on these bills and find ways to repeal the language that is threatening to Americans.
Okay, but do you find the NSA itself threatening to Americans? Are you among those who advocate that it should be abolished?
No, there's a reason to have intelligence agencies. There's a reason to conduct secret investigations. But there's a big difference between secret investigations and the kind of secret operations that go on and secret laws. Right now what we have are secret laws, and even members of Congress aren't getting the full facts about what's in the laws. When FISA courts issue a ruling, I can't see the opinion. Only certain members of our intelligence committees can receive the opinions, so I don't even know how the law is being interpreted.
All right, sir, thank you. Good luck at that meeting. We'll see if your colleagues stay quiet. In the meantime, this alert in. We were already down, but news of this ACLU suit through no accident did seem to escalate selling in the later part of the day, hinting not so just lightly here that this is expanding, that this is getting a little bit more ornery here and a little bit more involved, to a fellow who saw all of this playing out just the way it has been playing out and warned us about it. My friend and colleague, Judge Napolitano, what do you think of these latest developments?
Well, I'm not surprised that the ACLU filed the lawsuit. I just read the lawsuit. It's right on the mark. My own views are absolutely consistent with Mr. Abdo from the ACLU and with Congressman Amash. In fact, I would encourage Congressman Amash and his colleagues not to stay quiet about what they learned. What kind of a democracy is this, where the government tells our elected representatives what it's doing to violate our civil liberties and constitutional rights, and the elected representatives have to keep it to themselves?
It is true. They had been sworn to secrecy, though. It was less like that thing that Eric Holder did at the Justice Department. We're going to hold an off-the-record briefing about how we go off the reservation.
Well, that is not representative democracy as we understand it. What Congressman Amash hears, Congressman Amash should be free to tell the rest of us, whether we are his constituents or not. Now, as for this lawsuit alleges that the ACLU itself is a customer of Verizon and itself has had its own constitutional rights violated. That gets over the huge obstacle to filing these lawsuits called standing, where the plaintiff has to show that the plaintiff himself was injured. The ACLU is prepared to demonstrate that it's a Verizon customer. By the way,
how can it prove that it was injured if it was just among the 115 million phone records collected?
It's going to have to wait for some discovery to find out whether any of those phone records were acted upon.
What if they weren't?
Well, if they weren't, then there are Supreme Court cases that show that whenever the government illegally or unconstitutionally gets in your face and monitors what you do, you behave differently. You are afraid to express yourself fully. That's called chilling, and that's against the law for the government to do this. Look, the fact that this has been happening in secret, the fact that more than half the country is being watched by America's domestic spies, is potentially the greatest single violation of the Constitution by the federal government in the history of the country. This lawsuit that the ACLU filed and the attitude of Congressman Amash and his colleagues may expose the government for what it's done, which is the opposite of what we hired it to do. We hired it to enforce the Constitution, to protect our freedoms, and instead it has done the opposite.
Amazing and fast moving. Thank you, Judge, very much.
You're welcome.